actually some really interesting CIA research, which has now been declassified, about brainwashing. And it shows that even when you put people through awful situations and there's torture, there's brainwashing, you try and force them to change their behavior. When all of these brainwashed soldiers went back to the US, they reverted back to their behavior that they had before. So even when you try and force someone to change their behavior, it is very, very difficult to, if not impossible, if the context, if the environment they work in doesn't support it. And that's why leaders are so important in helping ensure that their people, their direct reports are changing their behavior.
I create clear thinking and decisive leaders who can amplify their influence. Contact me to find out how I can help you or your organisation. And today our guest is Nik Kinley. How you doing, Nik?
Very well, thanks.
Brilliant. Nik, what's the weirdest thing a customer has asked you to do, or a question maybe?
The weirdest thing anyone's ever asked me? Wow. Head blank. I think possibly the weirdest thing that I've ever been asked to do is to bring someone a Christmas tree. So I did quite a bit of work out in the Middle East and Saudi Arabia in particular. And I had a coaching client out there, and he asked me if I could smuggle in a Christmas tree so his wife could have a Christmas tree in the house.
I think that's pretty cool, actually.
Well, I refused because I'm a coward. And I just wasn't quite sure how I would explain it.
Yes, you might get caught up with all this kind of thing about bringing foreign plantation in. Oh, no, actually, it's probably better not to see you in the 9 o'clock news. So that's probably a good idea.
Yeah, that's cowardice is the better part of valor or something.
So, Nik, tell us a bit more about you.
So I've got a fairly meandering, winding background. I started off life in retail, worked my way up to manage a small supermarket. I did that for 5 or 6 years. And then I did what everyone does at that stage in their career, which is to go to prison, where I stayed for about 12 years. I should point out that wasn't at Her Majesty's pleasure, but I retrained as a forensic psychotherapist. And it might sound a million miles away from everywhere, but what I was doing there was writing reports for courts, should people be released or should they not? And I was trying to change people's behavior. And really, assessment and behavior change is then what I've been doing subsequently for the last 30 years. About 25 years ago now, I think 20 years ago, I moved back into business. I was in consultancy for 4 or 5 years. Then I joined BP, British Petroleum, where I kind of headed up their assessment globally. And then I moved to Barclays, where my title was Global Head of Learning. I'm not entirely sure there was an awful lot of learning that went on while I was there, but that's what the title said. And then about 10, 11 years ago, I made the move back into consultancy.
You know what? That sounds like such a fascinating story. There's like a million questions that I want to ask about that, and I may well do that. But I'm kind of curious about the idea that you can rewrite your leadership code. So I want to start off with telling me, what is the leadership code? Is it for one person, or do we all have our own unique one?
So the last 15 years, I've been writing books and running a research program with a colleague over at IMD Business School in Lausanne. And we had started off by writing about how leadership was possibly less about capabilities and more about the actual impact that we have, and looking at that kind of intersection between what we bring into a situation and actually what other people take out of it. So, for example, one of the things that we said in one of our previous books was what matters is less whether you are a caring leader and more whether people feel cared for. And they're two very separate things. And so where we'd got to in our research is that we were increasingly coming across leaders who were saying, you know what, there's just this thing about me I can't change. It's just the way I am. It's just, and coupled with that, we were also seeing leaders who were, I think, increasingly struggling, because the phrase we were hearing was that they just felt they were running on automatic, running from meeting to meeting with no time to think things through. And they were going on to leadership development programs and being told to think things through and act deliberately and all the rest of it. And they were just saying, well, I don't have time to do that because I'm just acting in the moment. And so what we really wanted to get into is, what is it that they are bringing into the moment that keeps coming out when they don't have the time to be at poise, when they don't have time to think about how they're being? What is it that's coming out? Where do these default ways of thinking and behaving really come from? These kind of leadership instincts that they've got. And so that's what we meant when we said the leadership code. We were looking at what are the underlying tendencies, instincts, and sensitivities that we all bring into situations that are there at the heart of us. And we called it the code because it kind of reminded us of a computer source code, because they're like pre-programmed instructions and rules that are there at the heart of us. And some, we don't always follow them, because there are times when we can be thoughtful, we can be at poise, but under pressure, we tend to fall back on those things, on that inner underlying code and set of instructions and rules and ways of behaving that we've learned. And so that's what we meant by the code. And what we were really curious about was, where does it come from? What can you do about it?
I like that. I certainly agree. Leadership is about the impact that you make. And that's something that I spend a lot of time focusing on. And it's about, I talk about leadership being personal to the person you're leading, but also you're bringing all your personal, your instincts, behaviors, your own leadership culture into that relationship. So I can totally understand what you're saying about leadership being about the impact. And I think that that's the thing that I would say has been missing in a lot of leadership theory in the past.
Yeah.
My view is that quite a lot of leadership theory is kind of manipulative, because if you can follow this procedure, whichever theory you pick, you do that, then people are going to magically do what you want. And there's no recognition on the interaction the leader makes, and who the leader is and what they do and how they behave has an impact on the behavior. So I totally get that. And I'm kind of curious if you're suggesting that, are you suggesting that the leadership code is kind of a mixture of genetics and environment?
So I think for the most part, it depends what aspect of ourselves that we're talking about.
Right.
I think there are, for the most part, when you have a look at it. So what we did is that we went back to the research, and we had a look at the last 50, 100 years worth of research. And what we really wanted to do was, rather than just generally say we are the products of our past, what we wanted to do was to say, okay, so which specific experiences lead through to which types of tendencies within us? What type of impact can that have on us as leaders, and therefore on the people around us too, and try and directly draw those lines up. Now, there are some aspects of that which are based almost entirely upon our personal previous experience. So, and to give you probably the most obvious example is how most people react to and deal with moments of tension or conflict. And what you find when you have a look at that is that most of how how sensitive we are to conflict, how we interpret conflict, whether we see it something constructive or something that we immediately get anxious about, or something that we respond very defensively to, most of that is based on our very early childhood experience. And when I say very early, it's probably set for most people before they reach 10. There's some research suggesting it can be as early as kind of like 3 to 7. But certainly long before you ever walk into a workplace, how you respond to conflict, to tension is kind of set into you. How your nervous system responds to it. And whether you respond primarily with anxiety or with anger and defensiveness, I think that is set long before we ever walk into a workplace. And yes, we can develop skills, and we can attend conflict management, courses and conflict resolution courses and all the rest of it. But in the moment, operating under pressure, in in the middle of a busy day, in a busy meeting, what we tend to rely on is these inner tendencies that formed in us long ago and are actually almost a core part of our personality. So some of these, like dealing with conflict, are very much based on our personal experience. And if you have a look at some of the things that inform, for example, how we respond to conflict, it tends to be things like how conflict was resolved in our families, how our parents responded to us when, if we had kind of expressed anger. Those are the types of experiences that where we learn how to do that kind of situation. There are other aspects of ourselves, though. One of the big surprises for me was that possibly the underlying tendency within us that most affects us as leaders is self-regulation, and in particular, emotional self-regulation. So the degree to which we kind of hide how we're feeling or just always constantly show it. And most of us, and all of us, we can either say we tend more to hide it and more to show it. Now, there's really, really strong evidence that around, and estimates vary, but probably around 60% of the degree to which we either internalize our emotions or externalize them and show them is genetically inherited. The other 40% comes from our early childhood experience again. But
Okay.
So there are, I think for most aspects of us, we learn it as we go along, but there is very definitely a strong genetic component in some aspects of ourselves.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. I certainly see the evidence for epigenetic, and certainly, I get asked that question a lot. Is leadership nurture or is it nature? And the way I'm looking at and interpreting what you're saying is that I can see how it would be natural to respond to events based on your programming.
Yes.
However, you're not stuck with your programming. It can be changed to a degree that you can adapt into a new set of programming which you've designed that becomes completely natural. Do you agree?
Not entirely, no.
Tell me more.
So I think that what tends to happen is that I mean, we debated for quite a long time what to call the book because you're stuck with yourself was one potential title that can give. But I think a lot of these inner tendencies are very, very difficult to change. And what we can do, however, is learn to either not trigger them, interrupt them, or learn new ways of behaving. And often to outsiders, to other people, that looks like we're changing. But in pure biological terms, those pathways that are formed in our brain when we were very young, which kind of lead us to behave in certain ways, they're still there. We're not erasing those old pathways. Those neurological pathways in our brains, those old ways of seeing the world, interpreting the world, and behaving are still there. What's happening is that either we're stopping them from being triggered, we're learning how to interrupt them and stop them, or we're learning new ways of behaving and forming new pathways in our brain. And really, that's where we get to in the book, which is kind of, how do you do that? What's the way you can do that? And hence we call it kind of rewriting the code, because you are rewriting in your brain kind of new ways of behaving, laying down new paths to follow.
So I'm wondering if we are agreeing, because my view on the neuroscience is that if we are rewiring, laying down new pathways that we start to use more often, so they become the subconscious because those pathways are thicker, then the old pathways which are there become a lot weaker because they're not as used as much. So isn't that not in effect rewiring something to be something different?
To a certain extent, what the evidence kind of does suggest, however, is that it takes quite a long time for that to happen.
Oh yeah,
And
that I can
it's and for most of us in most situations, it will require us to consciously think about how we want to be. And actually, I think a good part of learning to behave in new ways and of changing, if we want to call it that, is to actually set up the situation beforehand so that we end up behaving in the way that we want to, rather than actually waiting till we're in the moment and thinking, oh, I ought to be trying to be like this or that.
I can get 100% behind, because yes, I agree, changing behavior isn't easy, um, but it's more than doable, I believe. But it takes
Yeah.
it's not, you need to have the intention to do it. It's not something that will happen without you intending to happen. And actually, so I know, like, when I'm working with people, talking about like hacking the brain and actually having strategies and things to actually enable the rewiring to happen at a more in-depth and firing pace. But you have to do the work. You
Yeah.
can't just wake up one day and go, I used to respond in this way when I was triggered, and today I'm going to be different. You have to work on it.
In educational circles, they call it scaffolding. We in a previous book we wrote about how the single best predictor of whether any attempt to change works, be that leadership development, be that, and there's evidence coming from alcohol recovery, from therapy on things like depression and anxiety. Almost any change you can think of, the single best predictor of whether it works is not the type of treatment, is not the quality of the coach or the trainer. It's the context that you go back to. It's the environment that you go back to. And so that's one of the things that led me into this work, or to begin with, because I was working with people in prisons, and they could be incredibly well-intentioned. And they could work really hard on themselves, and they could be really determined to do things right when they leave home, and then they go back to the same family problems, the same set of friends, the same situations, and it's really hard not to just go back to how you were being. And in fact, some of the earliest research on this comes out of the Korean War. When the American army began noticing that some of their soldiers were emerging from the Chinese-run Korean prisoner of war camps, effectively what we now call brainwashed. They were emerging as ardent communists. And these people had been through awful situations, had been tortured, and there's actually some really interesting CIA research, which has now been declassified and is available on the internet, all about brainwashing. And it shows that even when you put people through awful situations, and there's torture, there's brainwashing, you try and force them to change their behavior. When all of these brainwashed soldiers went back to the US, they went back to their families, they went back to their friends, they went back to their ordinary lives, they reverted back to their behavior that they had before. So even when you try and force someone to change their behavior, it is very, very difficult to, if not impossible, if the context, if the environment they work in doesn't support it. And that's why leaders are so important in helping ensure that their people, their direct reports, are changing their behavior.
Yeah, because the individuals need to want to make that change, because
but even if they want to, their boss has to support it. The environment that they work in has to support it.
Yeah, it's a hand-in-hand thing. Let's listen to a quick advert.
The Maverick Paradox. Judith Germain is an author, speaker, consultant, mentor and trainer, and the leading authority on Maverick leadership. She is the founder of the Maverick Paradox, which supports organizations to enhance their leadership capabilities and to help business owners develop and grow their businesses. Judith enables individuals, business owners, and organizations to improve their impact and influence. She is also HR Zone's leadership columnist, and her expert opinion has appeared in national, international, and trade press.
Welcome back to the Maverick Paradox. This is the podcast for the pathologically curious. Okay, so I'm curious. So your book,
Yeah.
Rewriting the Leadership Code, also has the subtitle, How Your Childhood Made You the
Yes.
Leader You Are, and What Can You Do About It? So tell me, let's do the first part then. So how did childhood make you the leader you are? Tell me more about that.
Okay. So a lot of our a lot of the I think the best way to understand this is to have a look at the neurology of it, of actually how the brain forms. And if you have a look at the very earliest connections and experiences that we have in life, right? So actually, for most people, that will be in utero. They'll probably hear their mother's voice, or even after birth. You know, they see a parent's face, they see they hear a voice. What is happening whenever they see or hear something is that it is activating a chain of brain cells. And if you have that experience enough times, that chain of brain cells, that pathway becomes associated with that particular sensation.
Mm.
And in exactly the same way, if you respond every time you respond to something or you behave in a certain way, there are other pathways and chains of brain cells being created. And you can imagine them pretty much like pathways that if they get walked upon quite a lot or enacted quite a lot, then those pathways become more distinct and stronger. And so that's why those early experiences that we have tend to be the most inset within us and the most well developed within us, because we've just repeated them a lot and a lot. They've tended to be very well walked pathways, so to speak, very strong pathways that react more quickly and that we're more likely to be able to follow. But it's even more than that these pathways become self-reinforcing. And to give you an example of that, there was a famous study done back in the 1980s, having a look at childhood aggression and the effect that that has on parents. And actually what they identified was actually this reinforcing loop. So if a child behaves aggressively, the parents might feel defensive. So the parents respond aggressively or in an annoyed way, which then reinforces the child's aggressive feelings. So the child behaves. And so these kind of, once we've got a way of interpreting the world or behaving in a certain way, it can really reinforce itself. Because let's say that you have an early experience and it creates a sense of fear in you, a sense of anxiety in you. Your anxiety pathways are becoming strengthened. So if you grow up in an environment, say a family environment, where your parents are arguing a lot, you will probably become anxious every time you hear your parents argue. And thereafter, that then carries through with us into our adults' lives. And you will probably, many decades later, as a leader, senior leader, confident in yourself, excelling at what you do, nonetheless, walk into a room, observe an argument between two people, and your nervous system will do a little twitch, right? Your anxiety system will suddenly kind of spark up. And that's why these early experiences, why our childhood experiences can be so influential, because they can affect not just how we see the world and interpret it, whether something's a danger, whether something's good. They don't just start laying down in kind of set ways of behaving that we then follow, but they also trigger certain reactions in our environments that can then reinforce our initial behavior. So let me give you another simple example. I've got a colleague who smiles a lot. And they say that they've been doing it, since they were a kid. Everyone says they're very smile, they're very happy. I'm more not that, right? If you ask my colleagues, I'm probably negative and miserable and critical, typical Englishman. Slightly cautious, slightly reserved. I don't do that. I don't walk into a room and just automatically smile at people. Now, have a guess which of us probably triggers the most positive reactions when we walk in a room, right? It's not me. And these kind of behaviors are behaviors that we've had ever since we were very young. We've had a lifetime of doing this. So they walk into a room, they've had a lifetime of smiling, of learning to expect other people to respond to them with smiles and positive behaviors. And I've had a lifetime of, well, not that, right? And so that's probably reinforced my behaviors as well. So these can be when we talk about the code, we're talking about really subtle things, right? We're talking about the types of things that we pay attention to. We're talking about the types of things that can trigger certain emotions in us. We talk about the types of way that we can regulate and manage our emotions and the degree to which they affect our behavior. And we're talking about things like attitudes to authority, straight from the parents, that ways of dealing with conflict, the degree to which we're an extrovert or an introvert. These sorts of things can be very subtle within us, but they're laid down by our earliest childhood experiences and typically within the family.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I was just thinking about that authority piece, and I was just reflecting on that. And I would say that my parents taught me to rely on my own sense of what was right and wrong, not the sense of other people. And if they were in authority, that didn't necessarily mean that they were right. And that was a strong lesson.
Yeah.
Which is probably no surprise, the Maverick paradox, But, and I was thinking about this the other day about early experiences. And I think about the things that I enjoyed watching on television when I was a child are all strong Maverick figures.
Yep.
Sherlock Holmes, Quincy,
Yep.
Captain Kirk, all the kind of things that I love to read as well. Macbeth, favorite play. And it's like they're all intelligent people that are different, quirky, but have a very strong sense of morality. Whether you agree with that morality is neither here nor there, but they have a strong opinion of their own self values. So it doesn't surprise me that I've gone down that pathway.
So one of the things that we find is that if you grew up with parents who were very strict, for example, and so that's if I'm assessing someone, that's one of the questions I'll always want to know, right? How strict were your parents? What were you praised for? What were you told off for? That kind of things. You can learn a lot about what drives people from that. But if you've got parents who are very strict, what you often find is that individuals can grow up feeling quite anxious about wanting to please their parents. And then you wind that clock forward 20, 30 years. And what you'll find in otherwise very mature leaders is a sensitivity to how senior stakeholders, so the board, if they're a CEO, investors, a chairman, how they feel about them and what they think about them. And what you tend to get in people who are anxious about that is greater conformity and sometimes ingratiation as well. And I would suggest that doesn't go with being a maverick leader or a maverick thinker. And actually, what I suspect that you would find is actually people who have, as a child, maybe had experiences in which they've been left feeling that things are unfair or things where they're not quite sure if they can rely upon parental support, or they might distrust it. They might grow up feeling a bit more angry. And therefore, in those people, you find a greater questioning of authority. And I think that a greater questioning of authority is very different from a creativity, but it is often what is required for people to break the mold.
Yeah. I'm interested in that, and just, I don't know, I guess my view is whatever you need to do to survive your childhood, and I'm coming to the believing that everybody survives their childhood, is fine, whatever it happened to be that you were doing. But once you've reached adulthood, you can, once you're away from those early experiences, you then have the choice to do something about it. And some people will automatically just do it because of childhood experiences, and others will find it a lot harder. But I think that with support, whether that's coaching, mentoring, for some it might be therapy and counselling, you can change how you adapt to the world and how you interact with it.
So I agree entirely. I think we all probably underestimate the degree to which we are influenced by our childhoods, right? And I think that's probably especially so in leaders, because as leaders, we project a sense of being in control. In fact, it's almost important to feel that we're in control. Otherwise, it can be quite difficult to function, right? But and so I think because of that, we probably underestimate the degree to which some of the things that we do, like for example, the people that we are professionally attracted to, that we like to work with, the people that we go to for opinions, can be very much influenced by the types of environments that we grew up in. So to give you just another simple example, there is a pretty distinct difference between optimists and pessimists in terms of the types of people that they like to go to for advice. So there are some leaders that I'll work with who will say, "Oh, I one of the questions I'll ask is who don't you go to advice, and or to hear their opinion?" And they say, "Oh, well, I'll never go to so and so because they're a naysayer. They're always looking at the downside. They're always looking at risk." And you can bet that those people are probably optimists, and you can bet that the reason that they got that way is that they grew up in an environment in which they either there was a positive emotion was expressed a lot and negative emotion was quite suppressed, or it can be that they grew up in an environment in which they were always encouraged to do things and try things out. But they might not see that as a bias, but nonetheless, it can affect who they listen to and who they don't go to. And obviously, when it comes to decision making, the risk for us is that we all create our own echo chambers with the types of people that we prefer speaking to, the types of people that we go to for advice. And we probably don't see it as an echo chamber, but it does become so. We get this kind of focal drift over the years as we end up speaking to certain people more than others. And when that happens, it becomes a risk for decision making because you're closing off part of the conversation.
I think that's so interesting because, like, for maverick leaders tend to go to people that will challenge them.
Yeah.
And for those, and if they're in a situation where everybody agrees, they'll just switch up the scenario so that there's debate. They're less likely to make a decision where everybody agrees straight away because it's a feeling that the issues haven't really been worked through.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously is that as people become leaders, the impact of these underlying tendencies just becomes more and more important because the stakes are higher because your remit is larger. B, it's on display, right? Everyone sees you when you're having a good day. Everyone sees you when you're having a bad day, right? It's on display in a way that it's not when you're at the start of your career. But the other thing is that the further up the rung we go, the more senior we become, the more our job is about helping other people to do things. The less it is, when you first start out, you can be really successful by being good at what you do. As you become more senior, it becomes more about helping other people to be really good at what they do. And therefore, one of the places that we ended up in the book that really surprised us was that your childhood, your past, doesn't just affect how you behave and how you think, it ends up affecting how other people behave too. And that's a bit mind-bending, that how your relationship with a parent 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago can be affecting how your team behave and the culture within your team today. But you can draw a pretty straight line between these things.
Yeah, I see that when I'm mentoring people, then you start asking the questions, and then it does at times go back to some event or some relationship in the past back at childhood. And that's a good place. The awareness of that's a good place to break those associations. So on the basis, I'm pretty sure you're not going to tell me that you're stuck with who you are as a child. So how does the adult then move forward?
So the key thing, so first of all, I think you with these types of very deep underlying tendencies, the initial challenge is to spot them. Because they tend to be automatic ways of interpreting the world or responding to it that we don't really think about. We just do them, right? And because they tend to come out most when we're not really thinking about what we're doing and we're just kind of like falling back on default ways of being, that and when we're being less deliberate, they're even harder to spot. So these things live in the dark, so to speak. And so the first place to begin is to try and identify how they are affecting you now and where they have come from. And for most people, that journey begins with something isn't going right, right? So something isn't working the way that they wanted to. There was a leader I was working with recently who came to me. This all started by saying his team wasn't taking the initiative enough, and he was getting really frustrated with them.
That's not, I'm giggling because that's such a common complaint, isn't it?
And so when I dug into it and I had a look at it more, a couple of things emerged, and see if you reach the same conclusion I did. First of all, he was, to put it in technical terms, a bit of a control freak. So we'd come up through an engineering background with bosses who'd always told him, emphasis on quality, on getting everything right. He had a real fear of making mistakes. And as a result, he had developed into someone who tended to be very detail-oriented, lean into things, not empower his team very much, take over, take control. He was great at solving problems. This was a good reason of why he had been successful in his career. That actually it had enabled him to that he personally always took the initiative, right? He never walked past a problem. And that's why he couldn't understand why other people weren't, stepping in and doing what he was doing. And that was because he was taking control. He was taking charge. He also had a tendency to cut down debate. He could be very black and white in his views. He didn't ask an awful lot of questions. And so you start joining all these dots, and you've got a leader who was inadvertently discouraging other people from coming to him with answers because they knew he was going to have a very clear view. And if they didn't have the right answer, he would probably act quite critically. Would tend to lean in and take control of things. No matter what they brought to him anyway, he would just end up making sure that things were done the way that he thought that they ought to. And so for us, so for me, having a look at that, it was like, well, that might be a reason why they're not taking the initiative, why they're not being proactive, right? Because you're the one who's doing it. You're eating up all the oxygen in the air. And so we went back and we had a look at, okay, so why do you do this? And we figured out that actually he'd been doing this throughout his career. And we could trace it right the way back to his relationship with a very critical, very hard to please father, who was quite distant, but also incredibly successful in business himself. So this poor guy, this leader, felt he had incredibly big shoes to step into. He'd grown up in that kind of environment where, okay, you got a B+. Well, that's good, but why wasn't it an A? What went wrong? And in that type of environment, which was then reinforced by then going into kind of engineering, which is, again, that kind of let's get everything right type of environment, a quality environment, an operations environment. It had reinforced these childhood tendencies, but it all stemmed from that fear of failure, the feeling that he had to get it right himself. He had to get the right answer. And so we had to go back, and once we'd identified what it was, that then enabled us to know what the solution ought to be. And this is why I think it's actually important, because people sometimes say, it doesn't really matter. Why do I have to go back and, think about what happened in my childhood? Who cares? And the reason for that is that the mechanism through which your past has influenced you will determine what type of solution will work best with you. So, for example, if it is the fact that you have a certain belief in your brain, right? I must do a certain thing. I need to do a certain thing. Well, then you can think about ways of stopping that belief. or inserting a new one. So I've worked with some leaders, and this may sound entirely mad, but it works, who will have a little mantra that they say to themselves before they go into a meeting, or will write a little phrase at the top of their notepad to remind them of a certain thing, right? You know, I must ask more questions, whatever it is. That's the type of thing that this guy was doing. If it's a belief or way of interpreting the world, that leads to one type of solution. If it is a way of responding, a type of behaving, well, then that tends to lead to a different type of solution. A different type of solution that tends to be more about learning new scripts, new ways of doing things. So with this gentleman, this leader, one of the things that we talked about was, what is his script for dealing with a problem, and where did he learn that? And actually, he'd learned his script from his father, who had this very task-focused takeover. Right, let's deal with it. This is the way that you need to do it. And he had this certain script, this certain way of behaving in this situation. And for this leader, it was just automatically triggered. It was just what he did. So we actually sat down and wrote a new script, a new way of doing it that he wanted to do. And then we got into how he could actually practice it and repeat it. So it's the way the way to deal with how your childhood made you the leader you are is to figure out what was the mechanism involved. What were those influences? Because if you know what the influences were, you know how to interrupt them, you know how to stop them, you know how to write something new. And it's important you do know what they were, because if you don't know what they were, they're just going to keep coming back. They're just going to keep coming out. So I'm not a great believer in insight for insight's sake. For me, insight has to lead to something. And so know your childhood so you know how to deal with it. And that might be making the most of a strength that it's given you, or it might be about, you know what, adapting, balancing some aspect of yourself.
Thank you for that. I think that's really useful. I'm similar, I guess, because I'm all about behavioural change, that there's no point in knowing unless you're going to do something about it. It's just a waste of effort. And I can certainly see that. I think the only thing I would probably add is that it's not always childhood behaviour that would have such an impact. Sometimes it's an event that has occurred. So, you know.
Yeah.
So that's the only thing I would say, is that sometimes when you're working with somebody or a team or whatever, and you're observing certain things, the trigger for that may well be a series of events, as opposed to a childhood trauma. And when I say trauma, I'm not necessarily thinking it has to be traumatic, but something that, you know, is repeated often enough to make a
most of the influence upon us aren't, for most people, it's not big things. I mean, we tend to remember the big events, right? So which is often tends to be something. It could be something really great in our lives that's happened to us, an opportunity to go traveling when you're young, or something wonderful happening, you know, having children, getting married. Or it can be something terrible that's happened to you. So I worked with one leader recently who was bullied. I've worked with other leaders, and I'm sure you have too, who went to boarding school and have to deal with both the dark side of what that's created within them, but also, you know, the strengths that it enabled them to develop as well. But for most people, it's the subtle, quiet experiences that were just repeated again and again. And it's that background noise of your life, which you will have learned to adapt to, and that has led to these kind of really subtle ways of responding.
Yeah, that makes sense. But also, when you think about it, it's not just that kind of background music, is it? It's also recognizing how you move forward, and that you determine what things are. Because I think that people can have a learned helplessness, like, this is how it was. And I think it's also perspective, because you could have a terrible childhood from other people's perspective, but if you haven't interpreted it that way, you've interpreted your childhood as a positive thing, then it is a positive thing, even if other people. So, for example,
Absolutely.
Like, back in the 70s, practically every child was given a door key and told you to sort yourself out. But if you talk to like somebody in Generation Z, for example,
that's neglect.
they'll be like, "How on earth could they leave you? That must be really traumatic."
But
not necessarily the way that those children and adults now would have viewed. They would have viewed it from a very idealistic. I mean, even now, it's like sometimes I watch a generation before that. I remember watching. I think it was Amazon Swallows or something like that. And then you think, or even like the Enid Blyton books, when the kids run off and they go off and down caves. And I'm like, seriously, you'd let those kids run in a cave the whole day? But at the time, those children would never have interpreted that as neglect or abuse or anything. They would have seen it as fun. So I think sometimes we have to be really careful when we're working with individuals not to name something from your perspective without waiting to see how they named and how they have interpreted that event, because it can be very dangerous. And I have seen before where an over-enthusiastic coach has pretty much traumatized somebody by giving a quite harsh interpretation of them, in a way that I just saw their whole soul crushed. They went through. I was like, so look, oh my God.
I think what you said stands out most strongly when you look at cross-cultural differences. I kind of went into the research thinking that we would find huge cross-cultural differences in which specific experiences tend to lead to what particular kind of outcomes in people. And actually, that's not what we found. And the reason we didn't find it is because it's all about the child's perspective.
Yeah.
So it's not about whether society thinks you've got a helicopter parent or not, who's overly pushy and overly controlling. It's what you experience. And it's not whether society thinks you've got an overly harsh parent or not. It's what you experience, whether you felt you could rely on your parents' love, whether you felt you were harshly treated, that sort of thing. So that one kind of way that it really shows out that it's your experience, not necessarily what happened. I think the other thing that we need to remember is that all of these tendencies are adaptations.
Yeah.
They are ways that they're like lessons learned that have become written into the code of our brains, right? Written into the biology of our brains. So they are all adaptations. So they are useful things. They are something that at some point has felt like a useful way of responding. Whether it was useful or not, we can, but it has been an adaptation. And there are very few tendencies that are either always good for us or always bad for us. There are very few. So, being an introvert is very useful sometimes and not so great in other ways. And same with being an extrovert. I know extroverts tend to be seen positively with everything, but you know what? There are downsides to it as well. And so all of these tendencies are adaptations, and they all have a good side and they all have can have a negative side. And whether they're a strength or a weakness depends upon the context you're operating in. And the job that you're in, the company that you're in, the people that you work with, the precise situation that you're in. And so I think what's really important is that every time you walk into a situation, a job, a meeting, a decision, and you go with your instinct, you go with your underlying tendencies, you go with what your default sense is of doing what's right. Every time you do that, you're gambling. You're effectively gambling that your instincts, your underlying tendencies are right for the moment that you're in. And so there is no good code. There is no bad code. And all that matters, and I think the biggest test of and you might not be able to control what that code is. You might be inherited. You might have learned it through your upbringing that you had no control of. But what you do have control over is what you do about it. Because
that makes sense to me.
It's about what you choose to do with it. And I think that's probably the best test of character, the best test of leadership. Whether you choose to just blindly gamble that actually your instincts are correct, or whether you choose to do something about it, to think about it, take control of it, and shape your impact and actually try and be more purposeful, more deliberate in what you're doing so that you have the impact, so that you can be a leader.
I like that. And I like it because it really sums up what Maverick leadership is about. It's a contextualized, adaptive leadership style. It's, with you and how you interact with the world at the heart of it.
Yeah. So, I mean,
that how everybody uses the principles is going to be a bit different because everybody's different.
Yeah. And so, I mean, a previous book we wrote, Leadership OS, we began from a point of irritation and annoyance. And it was because we described how we thought we were living in a cult of capability almost, where there's an awful lot of providers out there and there's an awful lot of talk about, having the right capabilities. Leaders need a certain set of capabilities. But every single, it's hard to go on LinkedIn without seeing another kind of, leadership model. Should you be a transformational leader? Should you be a benevolent leader, a servant leader? But what isn't advertised so much is that every single leadership model you can think of has been shown in some circumstances to not just not help, but to actually decrease performance. There is no one way that works. And what's important is that we adapt to the situation that we're in. And yes, there's some things that we've got to remain core to us and that don't change, our values, for example. But there needs to be some things that are consistent to us. But if you always follow a certain way of behaving, if you are just the way you are, then sooner or later, you're gonna fail.
Yeah, I agree. And it just makes me feel more comfortable about Maverick leadership that you say that, because it's not a tick box, you need to do these things and everybody's going to move. It's much more, I say, adaptable and contextualized.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the challenges for leaders is that there's an awful lot of stuff out there that say you just need to do these three things.
Yes, and that's ridiculous. How silly is that? I mean, seriously.
Well, I mean, yeah, it is. I mean, yeah, seriously, it is. I think silly is the polite way of putting it. But there is that, if you're a busy leader, right, running around, there's an awful lot of just tell me what I should do. And in fact, one of the things that we point out right at the beginning of rewriting your leadership code is this isn't easy. It's not going to happen overnight. But if you want to make a difference to yourself, if you want to become a better leader in a more sustained way, you need to think about this stuff. And actually, you probably need to talk to someone about it, be it, a colleague, a friend, a partner. But, this isn't, there are no easy answers here.
Brilliant. Nik, that's wonderful. You'll have to come back because I'd love to talk to you some more, actually. So you will definitely have to come back. That's the rules now. So you have to come back. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And thank you once again for tuning in to the Maverick Paradox podcast. I am Judith Germain, your host, and I hope you've enjoyed today's conversation.
The Maverick Paradox Magazine. The Maverick Paradox Magazine is for the pathologically curious. Written by a swagger of socialized mavericks who are divergent thinkers, the magazine tackles the biggest issues affecting maverick leaders today. You might be a business owner or a leader within an organization who wants to have your thinking challenged, to be exposed to a diversity of thought, or to learn from diverse experts in their fields. If so, the Maverick Paradox Magazine is for you. Join the swagger at themaverickparadox.com and engage in the conversation.